The sledgehammer felt heavier than it should have in Margaret Chen's calloused hands as she stood before the weathered barn that had watched over her family's 100 acres for nearly 2 centuries. Morning mist clung to the valley like a shroud, and somewhere in the distance a crow called out across fields that no longer bore her name. The barn's red paint had long since surrendered to time, leaving behind silvered wood that groaned in the October wind. In 72 hours, the bank would seize everything: the farmhouse where 3 generations had been born, the orchard her grandmother had planted during the Depression, the creek where her late husband Thomas had taught their daughter to fish. But this barn, this crumbling monument to better days, she could at least bring down on her own terms. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret was 53 years old, though the mirror lately suggested otherwise. Deep lines framed eyes that had once sparkled with the kind of hope that comes from believing hard work and honest living would always be enough. Her dark hair, pulled back in a practical braid, showed more silver than it had just 2 years ago, before the accident that took Thomas, before the medical bills that came after, before the drought that killed their chances of recovery. She wore Thomas's old work jacket over her flannel shirt, the fabric still carrying the faint scent of his tobacco and the earth he'd loved more than anything except his family. The sledgehammer's first blow against the barn's support beam sent a shudder through the entire structure. Dust exploded into the air, dancing in the slanted morning light that pushed through gaps in the walls. Margaret struck again and again, each impact releasing something more than just the physical structure. It was fury at the unfairness of it all, grief that had nowhere else to go, the desperate need to destroy something before strangers came to claim what her family had built. Her daughter Emma had begged her not to do this alone. At 28, Emma had inherited Thomas's practical nature and Margaret's stubborn streak, a combination that made her both fiercely protective and impossibly frustrating. She'd driven up from Richmond yesterday, her city clothes looking out of place against the rural landscape, her lawyer husband Michael trailing behind with his briefcase full of bankruptcy papers and sympathetic looks that made Margaret want to scream. "Mom, at least wait until we can hire someone," Emma had pleaded the night before. Standing in the farmhouse kitchen, where 4 generations of Chen women had kneaded bread and canned vegetables and argued about everything from politics to pie crust. "The barn's not safe. Dad always said the foundation was compromised." But Margaret couldn't wait, couldn't stand the thought of strangers tearing down what Thomas had promised to restore, back when they still believed in futures and 5-year plans. So she'd risen before dawn, before Emma and Michael stirred in the guest room, and walked out to face the barn alone. The structure was massive, built in 1847 by her husband's great-great-grandfather, a man named Samuel Chen, who'd fled west from Virginia with nothing but determination and a vision of land he could call his own. The barn had survived the Civil War, 2 fires, and the economic collapse that had destroyed so many family farms in the region. Its hand-hewn beams bore the marks of tools that no longer existed, and its stone foundation had been laid with a precision that modern contractors still admired. Thomas had loved this barn with an intensity that Margaret sometimes envied. He'd spent countless weekends out here, cataloguing the old tools hanging from rusty nails, photographing the fading advertisements painted on the interior walls, researching the barn's history with the dedication of a scholar. "There's something here, Maggie," he told her once, running his hand along a support beam. "Something important that my family meant to pass down. I can feel it." Margaret had smiled and nodded, indulging what she'd assumed was romantic nostalgia. Thomas had always been drawn to stories, to the idea that their lives were part of something larger than just planting and harvesting and paying bills. He'd kept journals documenting every detail of the farm's history, interviewed elderly neighbors about the old days, even corresponded with historical societies about the Chen family's role in the community. Then came the tractor accident that should have been survivable. the infection that modern medicine should have stopped, and the 3 weeks in intensive care that drained their savings and maxed out every credit card and mortgage they could secure against the land. By the time Thomas died, whispering something about the barn that Margaret couldn't quite hear over the machines keeping him alive, they were already financially destroyed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Another swing of the sledgehammer, and this time something shifted. A section of wall tilted inward with a groan that sounded almost human. Margaret stepped back, breathing hard, sweat already dampening her shirt despite the cool morning air. The barn was resisting her, as if it understood what she was trying to do and refused to go quietly. She moved to a different support beam, one that Thomas had marked years ago with red paint, indicating it needed replacement. The wood here was softer, compromised by decades of moisture and insect damage. The sledgehammer sank deep with each blow, and Margaret found a rhythm: lift, swing, impact, repeat. The physical exertion felt good, gave her anger somewhere to go besides the endless loop of what-ifs and if-onlys that had consumed her thoughts for 2 years. The beam cracked suddenly, a sharp report like a gunshot that echoed across the empty fields. Margaret jumped back as the entire section of wall sagged dramatically. For a moment she thought the whole structure might collapse at once, burying her in 2 centuries of history and putting an end to all her problems in one swift stroke. But the barn held, groaning and shifting but refusing to fall. That's when she noticed it, a gap in the stone foundation that hadn't been visible before, now exposed by the shifted wall. The morning sun angled through the opening, illuminating something that made Margaret's breath catch. The stones weren't solid here. They'd been carefully arranged to conceal a space behind them, and in that space she could see the dark outline of what looked like steps leading down into the earth. Margaret set down the sledgehammer and approached slowly, her heart suddenly pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with physical exertion. She knelt by the opening, pulling away loose stones that came free with surprising ease, as if they'd been designed to be removable. The gap widened, revealing more of the staircase, old stone steps, worn smooth by use, descending into darkness beneath the barn. A hidden cellar, but Thomas had explored every inch of this barn, documented everything. He would have found this, unless the concealment was so complete, so intentional, that even someone looking wouldn't see it without the structure being partially destroyed. Margaret's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone and turned on its flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a space that took her breath away. This wasn't just a root cellar or storm shelter. The underground room was large, perhaps 20 feet square, with walls made of the same carefully fitted stone as the foundation. But it was what filled the space that made Margaret's world tilt sideways. Wooden benches lined the walls, worn smooth by countless bodies. The ceiling was low, reinforced with massive timbers that bore no signs of rot, despite what must be nearly 2 centuries underground. And on the far wall, barely visible in the phone's inadequate light, she could see markings, symbols, and words carved or painted into the stone. Margaret knew what she was looking at, had read enough history, heard enough stories whispered in the community, understood enough about her husband's family and the choices they'd made in a time when such choices could cost everything. This was a station on the Underground Railroad, hidden beneath their barn for nearly 200 years, waiting to be discovered. Her phone buzzed in her hand, making her jump. Emma's name flashed on the screen, but Margaret didn't answer, couldn't answer. She was already climbing down the stone steps, drawn by something stronger than caution or common sense. The air grew cooler as she descended, carrying a smell of earth and time and secrets kept. The underground room was larger than it had appeared from above. Margaret's flashlight beam swept across the space, revealing details that made her historian's heart race. The benches weren't just worn, they bore carved initials and dates: 1849, 1852, 1857. Messages of hope and fear and determination scratched into wood by hands that had nothing left but the dream of freedom. In the corner, she found wooden crates, their contents long since deteriorated, but their purpose clear supplies for people making the desperate journey north. Blankets reduced to fragments. The remains of what might have been food containers. A child's wooden doll, its painted face still visible after all these years. But it was what Margaret found behind the largest crate that changed everything. A wooden chest, smaller than a trunk, but larger than a jewelry box, made from walnut that had aged to a deep, rich brown. The lid bore a symbol Margaret recognized from Thomas's research, a star with 7 points, a coded sign used by conductors on the Underground Railroad. Her hands shook as she lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had remarkably preserved them, were letters. Dozens of letters, tied with ribbon that crumbled at her touch. Margaret carefully extracted the first bundle and unfolded the top letter, holding her phone close to read the faded ink. The handwriting was elegant, educated, each letter formed with precision. But it was the signature at the bottom that made Margaret's knees weak, forcing her to sit down hard on one of the ancient benches. She read it 3 times, certain she must be mistaken, that the poor light and her own exhaustion were creating illusions. But the signature remained unchanged. Abraham Lincoln. Not a copy, not a reproduction. An original letter, written in 1858, addressed to Samuel Chen, friend and brother in the cause of liberty. Margaret's ancestor, Thomas's great-great-grandfather, had corresponded with Lincoln before he became president, during the years when he was still a lawyer in Illinois, speaking out against slavery and building the network that would eventually fracture the nation. Margaret's phone buzzed again. Emma, calling for the 3rd time. Above her, she could hear footsteps on the barn floor. Her daughter must have woken up and come looking for her. But Margaret couldn't move, couldn't speak, could only sit in this hidden room beneath the barn and hold in her trembling hands a piece of history that would change everything. There were more letters in the chest. She could see them, each one potentially containing secrets that had been buried for reasons she was only beginning to understand. The Chen family hadn't just owned a farm in antebellum America. They'd been part of the resistance, risking everything to help others find freedom. And they'd been connected to figures whose names now filled history books and monuments. "Mom?" Emma's voice filtered down from above, tinged with worry and frustration. "Mom, where are you? What happened to the wall?" Margaret looked up at the gap in the foundation, at the morning light streaming down the stone steps, at the barn that had kept its secrets for so long. In 72 hours, the bank would take this land. But what she held in her hands, what lay hidden in this underground room, this changed the equation entirely. She stood, carefully placing the letter back in the chest, her mind already racing ahead to what needed to happen next. Historical significance meant legal protection, meant delays in foreclosure, meant attention from preservation societies, and maybe, just maybe, a way to save what 4 generations had built. But more than that, it meant Thomas had been right. There was something here, something important that his family had meant to pass down. And now, with the barn's walls finally breached and its secrets finally exposed, Margaret Chen understood that she wasn't just fighting to save a farm anymore. She was fighting to preserve a piece of American history that had been hidden in plain sight, waiting for the moment when someone desperate enough, angry enough, or broken enough would strike the first blow that would bring it all to light. Emma's scream from above ground cut through Margaret's thoughts like a blade, not fear, surprise. Margaret scrambled up the stone steps, emerging from the hidden chamber to find her daughter standing frozen in the barn's doorway, staring at the partially collapsed wall and the gaping hole in the foundation where her mother had just climbed out. "What in God's name?" Emma's voice cracked. She looked from the destruction to her mother, covered in dust and cobwebs, holding a wooden chest like it contained the crown jewels. "Mom," You could have been killed. The whole structure could have come down on top of you. Margaret set the chest down carefully on a workbench that had somehow survived her demolition efforts. Her hands were still shaking, but not from fear. Emma, you need to see this, right now. See what? That you've lost your mind, that you're out here before sunrise trying to tear down a 200-year-old barn by yourself. Emma's anger was sharp. But underneath it, Margaret could hear the fear that had driven her daughter awake and out into the cold morning. Michael's calling, the structural engineer. This isn't safe. Emma. Margaret's voice carried a tone her daughter had rarely heard, not pleading, not commanding, but something else entirely. A kind of certainty that cut through argument. There's a room under the barn, a hidden room, and it's filled with evidence that your father's family ran an underground railroad station. The words hung in the air between them. Emma's expression shifted from anger to confusion to something like disbelief. What are you talking about? Margaret opened the chest and carefully extracted the letter she'd been holding, unfolding it with reverent care. This is dated 1858. It's addressed to Samuel Chen, and it's signed by Abraham Lincoln. Emma took the letter like it might shatter in her hands. Margaret watched her daughter's face as she read, saw the skepticism give way to shock, then to the kind of awe that comes from holding history itself. Emma was a high school history teacher, had spent years making the past come alive for bored teenagers. But this wasn't textbook history. This was her own family's story, written in the hand of a man who would become president. "This can't be real," Emma whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. She was already seeing what Margaret had seen, the precision of the handwriting, the weight of the paper, the way the ink had aged. These could be forgeries. People fake historical documents all the time. "Come down and see the room." Margaret was already moving back toward the opening in the foundation. "See where I found it. See everything else that's down there." Michael appeared in the barn doorway, phone pressed to his ear, looking like exactly what he was, a corporate lawyer from Richmond whose idea of rural life came from weekend antique shopping in Charlottesville. His khakis were already dusty just from walking across the yard, and his expression suggested he was deeply regretting his marriage to a woman whose family specialized in agricultural chaos. "The engineer can't come until Monday," he announced, lowering his phone. "And he says we should evacuate the immediate area until the structure's been assessed. This barn is officially a hazard." "Michael, shut up for 1 minute." Emma's words were distracted, her eyes still fixed on the letter. "Look at this." He crossed the barn carefully, eyeing the sagging walls with obvious concern. When Emma handed him the letter, his lawyer instincts kicked in immediately. Margaret watched him examine it with the kind of clinical attention he probably gave to contracts and depositions, looking for flaws, inconsistencies, reasons to doubt. "If this is authentic," he said slowly, "if even one of these letters is authentic, you're looking at a discovery of significant historical value. Major museums would want this. The Library of Congress, the Lincoln Presidential Library in Springfield." He looked up at Margaret. "Where exactly did you find this?" Margaret led them both down the stone steps into the underground chamber. Emma gasped when she saw the space, the carved initials, the worn benches, the remnants of supplies that told their own story of desperate journeys and impossible hope. Michael immediately began taking photos with his phone, his lawyer brain already cataloguing evidence. "This changes everything," Emma said, running her hand along one of the benches. "Mom, this could be a national historic landmark. Do you understand what that means?" "It means the bank can't foreclose on Monday," Michael said, his voice taking on the sharp edge of someone who'd found a legal angle. "Not immediately, anyway. A discovery like this triggers a whole set of regulations, historic preservation laws, archaeological site protections, mandatory assessments before any property transfer can occur." Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. Hope, maybe, or just the absence of the crushing inevitability that had defined every day since Thomas's death. How long? Weeks, at minimum, maybe months. Michael was already typing on his phone, his thumbs flying across the screen as he researched precedents. But we need to move fast, document everything, get expert authentication. Contact the State Historic Preservation Office before the bank even knows this exists. Emma had opened the chest and was carefully going through the other letters, her historian's training making her movements precise and gentle. There are at least 30 letters here, different dates, different correspondence. Some from Lincoln, but others, Mom, look at this one, it's from Frederick Douglass. The name hit Margaret like a physical blow. Frederick Douglass, the most famous escaped slave in American history, the voice of abolition, the man whose autobiography had exposed the horrors of slavery to millions, and he had written to Samuel Chen, had been part of whatever network Thomas's ancestor had built in this hidden room beneath their barn. Why would they hide all this? Emma's question was barely a whisper. If Samuel Chen was involved in something this important, this heroic, why bury the evidence? Margaret thought about that, thought about what she knew of the era of Virginia in the years before the Civil War, of communities torn apart by the question of slavery. Because it was dangerous. Because helping escaped slaves could get you killed, get your family killed, get your property seized. And because even after the war, even after emancipation, there were people who wouldn't forgive what Samuel did. But to hide it for this long? Emma gestured at the room. Generations passed. The Civil War ended 160 years ago. Why did no one ever tell these stories? Michael had stopped typing and was examining the walls more closely. Look at these symbols, he said, pointing to markings carved into the stone. These aren't random. This is code. Instructions for people passing through, maybe, or records of who came and went. They spent the next hour exploring the chamber, documenting everything with photos and careful notes. Margaret found more crates in the shadows, containing items that had been preserved by the cool, dry conditions underground. Shoes, small ones, children's sizes, worn through at the soles. A Bible with names written in the front, people who'd passed through this station on their way to freedom. A quilt with patterns Margaret recognized from Thomas's research as containing coded messages about safe routes and dangerous areas. The sun was fully up by the time they emerged back into the barn, blinking against the bright October morning. Margaret's phone had a dozen missed calls, the bank probably, or neighbors wondering about the early morning demolition. She ignored them all. For the first time in 2 years, she had leverage, had something worth more than the land itself. We need a plan, Michael said, slipping back into lawyer mode. First, we contact the State Preservation Office today. Then we get these letters to an authentication expert, someone credible, with credentials that will hold up in court if necessary. We'll need to file for an emergency stay on the foreclosure, citing the historical discovery as grounds for preservation review. Emma was still holding one of the letters, reading it again, as if hoping to extract more meaning from the faded words. Dad knew, she said suddenly. He must have known something. All those hours he spent out here, all that research he was doing. He was looking for this. The words hit Margaret harder than she expected. Thomas had known, or suspected, or hoped, had spent his final years trying to uncover what his ancestors had hidden. And he died before finding it, leaving Margaret to swing a sledgehammer in anger and grief and accidentally discover what he'd been searching for all along. He left journals, Margaret said quietly. Boxes of them. I couldn't bring myself to read them after he died. They're in the house. They walked back across the yard in silence, 3 people carrying the weight of discovery and possibility and the ghosts of questions that might never be fully answered. The farmhouse looked different to Margaret now, not just a building she was about to lose, but a repository of stories that connected her family to moments that had shaped the nation. Inside, Margaret led them to Thomas's study, a small room off the kitchen that she'd barely entered in 2 years. His desk was exactly as he'd left it, covered with books and maps and photocopies of historical documents. The walls were lined with shelves, holding his journals, leather-bound books he'd filled with his neat, methodical handwriting, documenting everything he learned about the Chen family history. Emma pulled down the most recent journal, dated to the year before Thomas's death. She flipped through pages filled with sketches of the barn's structure, notes about anomalies in the foundation, interviews with elderly neighbors who remembered stories their grandparents had told about the Chen Station and Freedom House. "Listen to this," Emma said, reading from an entry dated 6 months before the accident. "I'm convinced the entrance is in the barn's foundation. The measurements don't match the visible structure. There's space that's unaccounted for, hidden by the stonework. But I can't find the trigger mechanism, the way in. Samuel Chen was too careful, too thorough. He wouldn't have left the chamber accessible by accident." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Thomas had been so close, had mapped out exactly where the hidden room was, had understood that it existed, but had never found the entrance because he'd been looking for something intentional, a lever, a mechanism, a designed entry point. He hadn't anticipated that it would take structural damage to reveal what his ancestor had concealed so thoroughly. Michael was already on his phone, calling contacts at the University of Virginia, trying to reach professors in the history department who might drop everything to examine the letters. Emma continued reading through Thomas's journals, piecing together the research he'd done, the conclusions he'd reached. He believed Samuel Chen wasn't just a conductor, Emma said, her finger tracing her father's words. He thought Samuel might have been a station master, coordinating multiple routes through Virginia and into Pennsylvania. The letters would have been part of that network-coded communication between leaders of the Underground Railroad, hidden here because this location was considered secure. A knock at the front door interrupted them. Margaret's stomach dropped. The bank, almost certainly, or their lawyer, coming to discuss Monday's foreclosure proceedings. She moved to answer it, trying to prepare some explanation for why she'd been demolishing property that technically no longer belonged to her. But the person on her porch wasn't from the bank. Marcus Webb stood there, hat in his weathered hands, his dark face creased with concern. Marcus owned the neighboring property, 60 acres, that had been in his family for 5 generations, worked by hands that had once been enslaved but had found freedom and built something that endured. He was 73 years old, a walking encyclopedia of local black history, and one of the few people who'd understood Thomas's obsession with the past. "Margaret," he said gently, "saw you out at the barn early this morning, heard some of the wall come down. You all right?" She found herself telling him everything. About the hidden room, the letters, the evidence of Samuel Chen's involvement in the Underground Railroad. Marcus listened without interruption, his expression growing more intense with each detail. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "My great-great-grandmother came through that station, Sarah Webb. She made it north with her 3 children, spent 2 years in Canada, came back after emancipation. She used to tell stories about the Chinese man who hid them in a room under the earth, gave them food and warm clothes, risked everything to help people he'd never met and would never see again." The words settled over them like snow. This wasn't just abstract history anymore. It was Marcus's family story, connected to Margaret's family story, woven together by choices made in darkness and desperation nearly 2 centuries ago. Sarah said Samuel told her he did it because he understood what it meant to be seen as less than human. Marcus continued. Chinese immigrants weren't exactly welcomed in Virginia before the war. He'd faced his own share of hatred, his own struggles to be treated as equal. So when he had the chance to help others fighting for their humanity, he couldn't refuse. Emma appeared in the doorway, holding one of the letters. "Mr. Webb, would you be willing to testify about your family's connection to the station for the preservation application?" "I'll do more than testify." Marcus's voice carried the weight of generations. "My family's been documenting our history since Sarah first told those stories. We have oral histories, written accounts passed down through the years. If this discovery can save your land and honor what Samuel Chen did, I'll help however I can." By afternoon, the farmhouse had become command central for what Michael started calling Operation Preservation. He'd made contact with a professor of American history at UVA who specialized in the Underground Railroad, who agreed to drive out that evening to examine the letters. The State Historic Preservation Office had an emergency contact number, and Michael had already filed preliminary documentation of the discovery. Emma was cross-referencing Thomas's journals with the letters, building a timeline of Samuel Chen's activities. Margaret worked with Marcus, recording his family's oral histories on video, capturing testimony that would corroborate the historical significance of the site. But it was when Emma opened a letter dated 1863, after the Emancipation Proclamation, after the war had already torn the nation apart, that they found something that changed the entire equation. "Mom." Emma's voice was strange, tight with an emotion Margaret couldn't identify. "This letter isn't from Lincoln, it's to Lincoln, from Samuel Chen, and it's about something that was supposed to stay secret forever." Margaret moved to read over her daughter's shoulder. The letter was longer than the others, written in Samuel's own hand, the ink darker and bolder than Lincoln's elegant script. It spoke of a meeting, a gathering of leaders from both the Underground Railroad and the Union cause, held at this very farm in the spring of 1863. A meeting where plans were made that affected the course of the war, strategies discussed that had previously been attributed to military leaders and political figures. But it was the final paragraph that made Margaret's hands shake. "I have done what you asked," Samuel had written, "and buried the evidence where only those who understand its true value will find it. The names, the roots, the identities of those who risked everything, all of it is safe beneath the ground where freedom itself was cultivated. Should the cause be lost, this record will remain. Should we prevail, it will stand as testament to what ordinary people accomplished when they chose conscience over comfort." Emma looked up at her mother. "There's more down there, more than just the letters. Samuel buried something else, something he considered too important to destroy but too dangerous to reveal. And he left clues about where to find it." Michael had stopped typing. "If this letter suggests there's additional historical evidence hidden on this property, that's grounds for a full archaeological survey. Nothing can happen to this land, no sale, no foreclosure, no development, until experts have thoroughly examined the site." Margaret felt the weight of it settling on her shoulders. Thomas had been searching for a hidden room, but he'd been looking for something smaller, more contained than what they'd actually discovered. If Samuel had buried additional evidence, records that documented the full scope of the Underground Railroad network in Virginia, they might be dealing with one of the most significant historical discoveries in decades. "We dig," Emma said simply. "We start in the hidden room, and we follow every clue in these letters until we find what Samuel wanted preserved." "We can't just start excavating," Michael protested. "We need proper archaeological oversight, permits, documentation." "We have 3 days until the bank takes this property," Margaret interrupted. "Maybe we get the foreclosure delayed. Maybe your legal maneuvering buys us weeks or months. But what if it doesn't? What if a judge decides historical significance isn't enough to stop a valid debt from being collected? We can't risk losing access to whatever else is down there." Marcus spoke up quietly from where he'd been listening. "Sarah's stories mentioned a second room, deeper, underground. She said Samuel showed it to her, told her it was where he kept the records safe. She said it was filled with names. Names." The word echoed in the quiet kitchen. Names of escaped slaves who'd passed through Virginia seeking freedom. Names of conductors who'd risked everything to help them. Names of supporters who'd funded the network, sheltered refugees, provided false papers and safe passage. Names that had been deliberately hidden because revealing them, even after the war, could still destroy lives, still ruin families, still carry consequences that rippled through generations. Emma was already pulling out maps of the property, spreading them across the kitchen table. If there's a second chamber, it would need to connect to the first somehow. Underground passages, maybe, or separate entrance points. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, examining Samuel's letter for clues, studying Thomas's journals for insights he might have gathered, analyzing the construction of the barn's foundation for anomalies that might indicate additional hidden spaces. The UVA professor arrived just as the sun was setting. A woman in her 60s named Dr. Patricia Whitmore, who'd spent her career studying the Underground Railroad's Virginia routes. She examined the letters with barely contained excitement, her hands trembling as she verified dates and handwriting and historical context. "These are authentic," she confirmed after 2 hours of meticulous analysis. "I'd stake my reputation on it. And if even half of what Samuel Chen describes in this 1863 letter is true, you've discovered evidence of an organized resistance network far more sophisticated than most historians have ever documented." She looked at Margaret with something like awe. "Mrs. Chen, this discovery rewrites our understanding of how the Underground Railroad operated in the Upper South. The names mentioned in these letters conductors we'd only heard rumors about, routes we could never confirm. This is the evidence scholars have been searching for since the Civil War ended. Will it be enough to save the farm?" Emma's question was blunt, cutting through the academic excitement. Dr. Whitmore's expression sobered. "It should be. Historical sites of this significance receive federal protection, but I can't guarantee anything, especially on such a tight timeline. What I can tell you is that the story contained in these letters deserves to be told. Your husband's ancestor was a hero in the truest sense, someone who sacrificed personal safety for principle." Margaret thought about Thomas, about his determination to uncover this history, about the journals filled with research and speculation and hope. He'd known there was something worth finding, had believed it strongly enough to dedicate years to the search. And now, 2 years after his death, his widow had found it by accident while trying to destroy what he'd spent his life trying to preserve. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd come to the barn in anger, ready to tear down what she couldn't save. Instead, she'd uncovered the very thing that might save everything. As Dr. Whitmore packed up her analysis materials, promising to file emergency documentation with every relevant preservation organization, Margaret walked back out to the barn one more time. The structure looked different now, not a burden to be destroyed, but a guardian of secrets that had waited patiently for the right moment to be revealed. She descended the stone steps into the hidden chamber, sitting on one of the worn benches where desperate people had once rested during their journey to freedom. The letters were back at the house, being catalogued and protected. But this room remembered what no document could fully capture, the fear and hope of people risking everything for a chance at liberty. Thomas's voice echoed in her memory. "There's something here, Maggie, something important." "You were right," she whispered to the darkness. "You were always right." Above her, she could hear Emma and Marcus discussing excavation strategies, Michael on the phone with yet another lawyer or historian or preservation official. The farm that was supposed to die on Monday had suddenly become the center of a story that wouldn't be silenced. But Margaret knew they'd only found the beginning. Samuel's letter had been clear. He'd buried more than just correspondence. And somewhere beneath her feet, in a second chamber that no one had entered in over a century and a half, the real secrets were waiting to be discovered. The excavation began at dawn, before anyone from the bank could arrive with questions or legal objections. Margaret stood in the cool morning air, watching as Dr. Whitmore's team, 3 graduate students and a preservation specialist, set up equipment in and around the barn. Michael had managed to secure a temporary restraining order against the foreclosure, good for 30 days pending historical assessment, but everyone knew time was still their enemy. Emma had barely slept, spending the night poring over Samuel Chen's letters and Thomas's journals, looking for clues about the second chamber's location. She emerged from the house as the sun broke over the eastern hills, carrying a leather-bound journal and a hand-drawn map her father had created. "I think I found it," she announced, her voice hoarse from exhaustion but electric with certainty. Dad was mapping water sources around the barn. He documented every well, every spring, every drainage point. "But there's one water source that doesn't make sense, a dry well about 50 feet from the barn's eastern wall." He noted that the depth was wrong, too shallow for a functional well, but too deep to be a cistern. Marcus, who'd returned at first light with his own grandson in tow, studied the map. "My grandmother mentioned a well," said Samuel Chen, showed them where to draw water if they needed it. "She said it was special somehow, but I always thought she just meant the water was clean." They gathered around the old well, hidden now beneath decades of overgrowth and a rotted wooden cover. When they pulled away the vegetation, Margaret could see that the stonework matched the barn's foundation, the same careful construction, the same precisely fitted stones. This wasn't a well that had gone dry. It had never been meant to hold water at all. Dr. Whitmore descended first, secured by climbing equipment her team had brought. Her voice echoed up from the darkness. "There's a passage down here. Stone-lined, deliberately constructed. It's heading toward the barn." One by one, they descended, first the preservation team, then Emma, then Margaret herself, leaving Michael above to manage any interruptions. The passage was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to walk upright, and it stretched through the earth like a secret the land had kept for generations. Margaret's flashlight beam caught markings on the walls, more symbols, more dates, more evidence of the network Samuel had helped maintain. The passage sloped downward, deeper than the first hidden room, until it opened into a chamber that made the first discovery seem almost ordinary. This room was larger, reinforced with timbers that had somehow survived the centuries. But it was what filled the space that stopped them all in their tracks. Shelves lined every wall, and on those shelves sat books, dozens of them, leather-bound ledgers that had been wrapped in oilcloth and stored with the kind of care reserved for treasures beyond price. Emma reached for the nearest ledger with shaking hands. The first page bore Samuel Chen's distinctive handwriting. "Record of Souls Delivered," the heading read. "May God and history judge us kindly." What followed was a meticulous accounting of every person who had passed through Samuel's station between 1847 and 1865. Names, ages, descriptions, dates of arrival and departure, where they'd come from and where they were headed. Some entries included sketches, faces Samuel had drawn, preserving the features of people who'd left no other record of their existence. Margaret watched Emma's face as she read through the entries, saw tears streaming down her daughter's cheeks. These weren't just names. They were families, mothers with children, elderly couples who'd made the desperate choice to flee bondage in their final years, young men and women who'd risked everything for a chance at freedom. Sarah Webb's name was there, along with her 3 children, dated 1858. The entry noted that one child had been sick, that they'd stayed an extra week until she recovered. "There are hundreds of names here," Dr. Whitmore whispered, her professional composure cracking. "This is one of the most complete records of Underground Railroad passages ever discovered. Most stations kept minimal documentation specifically because it was so dangerous. But Samuel preserved everything. Another ledger contained correspondence copies of letters Samuel had written and received, creating a map of the entire Underground Railroad network across Virginia and into Pennsylvania. Reading through them, Margaret understood why her husband's ancestor had buried these records so thoroughly. The letters named prominent citizens who'd helped the cause, documented safe houses in towns where slavery was legally protected, revealed the identities of conductors who'd continued their work even after the war, when former Confederate sympathizers might seek revenge. Emma had moved to another shelf, where she found something that made her gasp. "Mom, look at this." It was a smaller book, more journal than ledger, written in a different hand. The first entry was dated 1866, after the war had ended and slavery had been abolished. Margaret recognized the handwriting immediately. It was her late husband's great-grandfather, Samuel's son, who'd continued his father's work of documentation. "My father has asked me to complete this record," the entry began, "so that future generations might understand the full scope of what was accomplished here. He is old now, his health failing, but his memory remains sharp. Today, he told me about the meeting." What followed was an account of something historians had speculated about for decades, but never confirmed: a gathering of Underground Railroad leaders in the spring of 1863, held right here at this farm. Frederick Douglass had been there, Harriet Tubman, John Brown's widow, conductors from across the South and Free States. They'd met to coordinate efforts, to share intelligence about which routes remained safe and which had been compromised, to plan for the inevitable end of slavery and what would come after. But more than that, they'd discussed something that had never made it into history books: a plan to preserve the names of everyone who'd helped, everyone who'd risked their lives for the cause, so that when the nation was ready to acknowledge its full history, the record would exist. Samuel Chen had been chosen as the keeper of that record, his station deemed secure enough, remote enough, to preserve the truth. "They trusted him," Marcus said quietly, reading over Emma's shoulder. "All these people, black and white and everything in between, they trusted a Chinese immigrant in Virginia to keep their secrets safe. That tells you something about the man he was." Dr. Whitmore was photographing every page, documenting the discovery with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious texts. "This changes everything we thought we knew about coordination among Underground Railroad conductors, the level of organization, the scope of communication. It was far more sophisticated than we imagined." They spent hours in the chamber, carefully cataloging its contents. Besides the ledgers, they found personal items: a watch engraved with initials, a silver thimble, a child's primer with handwriting practice inside. Objects left behind by people who'd passed through, perhaps tokens of gratitude, or simply things too heavy to carry on the next leg of their journey. Margaret found herself drawn to a small wooden box tucked into a corner. Inside was a collection of letters, different from the others they'd discovered. These were personal correspondence between Samuel and his wife, between Samuel and his children, documenting the toll this secret work had taken on his family. One letter, from Samuel's wife to her sister in California, spoke of sleepless nights and constant fear. "Samuel believes it is his duty," she'd written, "and I cannot argue with his conscience. But I lie awake, listening for sounds of discovery, for angry voices demanding to know why we harbor fugitives. I pray daily that our children will not suffer for their father's choices." Another letter, this one from Samuel to his oldest son, explained why he did what he did. "You asked me why we risk everything for strangers," Samuel had written in 1859. "When I came to this country, I was told I was less than human, that my people were fit only for the hardest labor, that we could never be true Americans. I know what it means to be judged by your appearance, to have your humanity questioned. When I learned that others were suffering even greater injustices, that men and women were owned as property, I could not remain silent. If I do nothing, then the hatred directed at them might someday be directed at you, at your children. We must stand against cruelty wherever we find it, or we are complicit in its continuation." Emma was reading the same letter over Margaret's shoulder, tears falling freely now. "Dad would have loved this," she whispered. "He spent years looking for proof of what his ancestor did, and here it is, all of it, everything he hoped to find." Margaret thought about Thomas, about the journals he'd filled, about the hours he'd spent in the barn searching for something he'd never lived to discover. The injustice of it burned, that he'd died before uncovering the truth, that she'd found it only through destruction and desperation. But as she looked around the chamber, At the careful preservation of these records, at the evidence of Samuel Chen's courage and conviction, she understood something else. Thomas hadn't been searching just for historical artifacts. He'd been searching for meaning, for connection to something larger than his own life. And through these discoveries, through the story that was now being revealed, he'd found it. Even if he hadn't lived to hold these letters in his hands, his work had led to this moment. They emerged from the underground chamber late in the afternoon to find the yard filled with vehicles. News crews had arrived somehow, probably tipped off by Michael's legal filings or Dr. Whitmore's contacts at the university. The sheriff was there too, looking overwhelmed by the sudden attention focused on a property he'd probably assumed would quietly transfer to bank ownership. Michael intercepted Margaret before the reporters could reach her. "The bank is pushing back," he said quietly. "They're arguing that historical significance doesn't erase debt, that they have a legal right to foreclose, regardless of what's been found." "Can they do that?" Emma's voice was sharp with fear. "Legally, maybe, but the optics are terrible for them. Foreclosing on a National Historic Landmark candidate? The publicity would be devastating." Michael glanced at the news crews. "Which is why I've been making sure every media outlet in Virginia knows exactly what's happening here." Dr. Whitmore had agreed to give a brief statement to the press, standing in front of the barn with the setting sun painting the old wood golden. She spoke about the discovery's significance, about Samuel Chen's bravery, about how this find would reshape historical understanding of the Underground Railroad. "This is more than a barn," she concluded. "It's a monument to ordinary people who did extraordinary things. It's a testament to the interconnected nature of American freedom movements, showing how immigrants and abolitionists and escaped slaves worked together toward a common goal. And it's a reminder that our most important history is sometimes hidden in the most unexpected places." The reporters turned to Margaret next, shoving microphones toward her, asking how it felt to make such a discovery, whether she'd known what was beneath her property. She stood there, covered in dust from the underground chamber, thinking about how to answer. "My husband knew," she said finally. Thomas Chen spent years researching his family's history. He believed there was something important here, something worth preserving. He died before he could prove it. But he was right. He was always right. Her voice caught. "This discovery is his legacy as much as it is Samuel Chen's." That evening, after the reporters had left and Dr. Whitmore's team had secured the underground chambers for continued study, Margaret sat on her porch with Emma and Marcus. The farm was quiet again, settling into the familiar rhythms of rural evening crickets chirping, a breeze rustling through the unharvested fields, the distant sound of Marcus's grandson feeding the animals. "What happens now?" Emma asked, her exhaustion evident in every syllable. Margaret had been wondering the same thing. Michael's legal maneuvering had bought them time, and the historical significance of the discovery provided strong grounds for preservation. But the debt remained, the bills were still unpaid, and saving the farm long-term would require more than just delaying foreclosure. Marcus cleared his throat. "I've been thinking," he said slowly. "My family owes a debt to Samuel Chen. Sarah and her children wouldn't have made it to freedom without his help. That's worth something." "Marcus, you don't owe us anything," Margaret protested. "Not you specifically, but the legacy, the history that's worth preserving." He leaned forward. "What if this became more than just your family's farm? What if it became a living museum? A place where people could learn about the Underground Railroad, about the real stories of how freedom was won. My family would contribute to that. So would others who have connections to this history." Emma sat up straighter. "A heritage site, with educational programs, guided tours of the underground chambers, exhibits about the people who passed through here. The National Park Service has programs for sites like this," Marcus added. "Grants, technical assistance, heritage area designations. It wouldn't happen overnight, but it could work." Margaret let the idea settle over her. It would mean the farm would never be just hers again, would never return to the simple life of planting and harvesting that had defined 4 generations. But maybe that life had already ended when Thomas died, when the bills had mounted beyond recovery, when she'd raised a sledgehammer against the barn wall. Thomas would have loved it, she said quietly. Making this a place where people could learn, where history was kept alive, that's what he always wanted. Over the following weeks, the impossible began to feel possible. The bank, facing overwhelming public pressure and the legal complications of foreclosing on a potential national historic landmark, agreed to negotiations. A coalition of preservation organizations, historical societies, and donors connected to Underground Railroad history came together to purchase the farm's debt, with the understanding that the property would be preserved as a heritage site. Margaret would retain ownership and the right to live on the land, but the property would be protected by conservation easement, ensuring it could never be developed or divided. Emma took a leave of absence from her teaching position to help establish the interpretive programs, working with Dr. Whitmore to create educational materials based on Samuel's records. The barn itself became the centerpiece of the site. Structural engineers stabilized the damaged sections while preserving the authentic character that had hidden its secrets for so long. The underground chambers were made accessible with careful climate controls to protect the artifacts, while allowing visitors to experience the spaces where desperate journeys had paused. Marcus's family donated their own records. Sarah's oral histories, letters she'd written after gaining her freedom, photographs of her descendants. Other families came forward too. People who'd never known their ancestors had passed through Virginia on the Underground Railroad until they heard about the discovery and recognized names in Samuel's ledgers. The day the site officially opened, 6 months after Margaret had first swung the sledgehammer against the barn wall, she stood beside a historical marker that now identified the property as the Chen Station, a verified stop on the Underground Railroad and one of the most thoroughly documented sites of its kind. Emma read the names from Samuel's ledgers aloud during the dedication ceremony, giving voice to people who'd been silent in official history for over a century and a half. Marcus spoke about his great-great-grandmother's journey, about the courage it took to flee bondage with 3 small children, about the stranger who'd risked everything to help them. Dr. Whitmore presented her findings, a complete accounting of Samuel Chen's network that had helped dozens of families reach freedom, that had connected with other stations across multiple states, that had operated successfully throughout the most dangerous years of the Underground Railroad's existence. But it was when Margaret entered the barn alone that evening, after the crowds had gone and the farm was quiet again, that she felt Thomas's presence most strongly. She descended the stone steps into the first chamber, now lit with careful preservation lighting, and sat on one of the worn benches where so many had rested during their journey. "We did it," she whispered to the darkness. "We saved it. Not the way either of us expected, but we saved it." She thought about the sledgehammer, about the anger that had driven her to destruction, about how close she'd come to tearing down the very thing that held the answers Thomas had sought. Sometimes salvation came through breaking, she'd learned. Sometimes you had to destroy what you thought you knew to discover what had been hidden all along. Emma found her there an hour later, sitting in the quiet chamber with tears on her face. Her daughter sat beside her, not speaking, just sharing the weight of all that had been lost and found. "Dad's journals," Emma said finally. "I've been reading them all, start to finish. Do you know what the last entry says?" Margaret shook her head. "I may never find what I'm looking for," Emma quoted from memory, "but the search itself has meaning. In trying to understand where we came from, I understand better who we are. And that's worth more than any artifact or document. That's the real legacy, knowing that our family chose courage when courage was costly, chose compassion when cruelty was accepted, chose to stand for something beyond our own comfort." The words settled over them both. Thomas had found what he was searching for after all, even if he'd never held the proof in his hands. He'd understood the truth that the documents now confirmed, that his ancestors had been part of something profound, something that transcended individual lives and connected to the broader story of human dignity and resistance. Margaret thought about legacy then, about what got passed down through generations. Not just land or buildings or even historical significance, but choices. Samuel Chen had chosen to risk everything for strangers. Thomas had chosen to honor that decision by searching for the truth. And now, Margaret and Emma were choosing to preserve that story, to make sure it lived beyond their own lives. The farm would never be just theirs again. But in losing that exclusive ownership, they'd gained something larger: connection to a story that mattered, to people who'd walked this land before them, seeking freedom, to a history that deserved to be remembered and honored. As they climbed back up the stone steps and emerged into the barn's familiar space, Margaret looked at the old structure with new eyes. The walls that had seemed like a burden now stood as a guardian of secrets that had shaped the nation. The foundation that had hidden its chambers for so long now opened them to people who needed to understand that freedom had always been a collaborative effort, built by people of every background who refused to accept injustice. Outside, the autumn stars were emerging in the clear sky. The fields that had gone unplanted this year would be cultivated again, but differently, as demonstration plots showing sustainable farming techniques, as spaces where school groups could learn about agricultural history, as living classrooms connecting past and present. Emma linked her arm through Margaret's as they walked back toward the farmhouse. "Do you think we did right by him? By Dad?" Margaret considered the question. Thomas had died trying to save this farm, through traditional means: hard work, stubborn persistence, the belief that determination would be enough. And it hadn't been. But through his death, through the debt it created, through the desperation that had driven Margaret to demolition, they'd uncovered something he'd only dreamed of finding. "I think he'd say the farm was never really ours to save," Margaret answered slowly. "It belonged to the people who passed through here seeking freedom, to the stories that needed telling. We were just the ones lucky enough to be its keepers for a while." They reached the porch, where Marcus waited, having stayed behind to help close up the barn for the night. He smiled at them, his face creased with the satisfaction of seeing justice done, history honored, and a legacy preserved. "Sarah would be proud," he said simply. "Knowing her story lives on, that people will remember what happened here, that's all she ever wanted. A chance to be seen as fully human, to have her journey acknowledged." The three of them stood together in the gathering darkness, looking out over land that had witnessed slavery and freedom, desperation and hope, loss and redemption. The barn stood silhouetted against the night sky, no longer a structure on the edge of collapse, but a monument to courage that had waited patiently to be recognized. Inside the farmhouse, Thomas's journals sat on the desk where Emma had been cataloguing them, creating a bridge between his research and the discoveries that had validated it. The letters from Lincoln and Douglas and countless others rested in climate-controlled storage, ready to teach new generations about the real complexity of America's struggle for freedom. And beneath the barn, in chambers carved from earth and stone, the names remained, hundreds of them, preserved by a man who understood that every person's story mattered, that freedom was worth any risk, that the future would judge them all on whether they'd chosen courage or comfort when it mattered most. Margaret felt the weight lift from her shoulders then, the crushing burden of debt and desperation replaced by something she'd almost forgotten: purpose. The farm had been saved, but more than that, it had been transformed into something that would outlast her, outlast Emma, outlast everyone who currently walked its soil. Thomas had been right. There was something here worth preserving. And now, finally, the world would know it too.